Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone who is tuning in the Portuguese channel, but also in the English channel. We'd really like to thank everyone for being with us. Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And at this moment, we're going to officially kick off the cycle of debates. Identification, rights, and control. We have somewhat of an operational issue. I can hear an echo, apparently. I'm not sure why. Well, this first meeting, we'll have a conference from Professor Keith Breckenridge. I'm going to share my screen with the other meetings we're going to have on the 8th of September. A roundtable about identification of incarcerated individuals. On the 15th of September, identification of the dead and disappeared. And on the 22nd, the final panel where we're going to discuss civil identification in Brazil. I just want to highlight that the other meetings will happen at 5 p.m. local time here in Brazil. It's a great joy to receive all of our colleagues that are going to discuss these topics with us. The idea when we put together the seminar was to give you an overarching view of this topic, the participation of researchers from different research centers, the participation of officials, managers, and operators who work directly with identification systems, or the departments of the government or even the justice system who work extensively with identification. Furthermore, we'll also have the participation of representatives from civil society. This is a topic that, in fact, it's present in our daily lives, but that quite often we don't have an open discussion about this topic. Quite often we limit ourselves to, the implementation of public policies or an external vision where we don't really see the details of how the system truly functions. So what we try to do with the cycle of debates, reflections about identification. Now, before we really begin with Professor Keith's conference, I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Roberto Kant, who's going to officially kick off the event. Yeah, thank you so much, Claudio. Initially, I would like to thank the invitation and congratulations for this initiative with this study group about violence from USP, from Marcos Alvarez, and other colleagues that are here with us. And also I'd like to greet our speaker today, Professor Keith. Thank you for being here with us. I represent here the National Institute of Science and Technology, where I'm a coordinator. And this institute is part of a program that began in 2008 to gather researchers in Brazil that would be willing not only to do top-notch research, but also to participate in international research and to transfer to the government or to society the benefits that this research will contribute. So since 2008, 2009, basically, we've been working along these lines because we already had a tradition in our university since the 80s, really, where we've been doing research supported by CNPq Research Institute of the government. Now, the Institute is present in 6 different countries, 8 states here in Brazil, and this network is quite concerned with the study of police practice and from justice systems, especially thinking about the differences and not really the similarities. And so in this way, the methodology is different to a comparative methodology, where we compare laws, where we try to compare by what's similar. But our focus is to see really what makes a justice system, or, well, anyway, in Brazil, it doesn't really include, it excludes, paradoxically, but how these systems work. We've come up with books and articles about this interventions, also in university outreach and social work. And we've also created a public security course, a distance learning course with public universities from the state of Rio de Janeiro for social public security, which is for public security professionals. More than 2,000 students until now. And recently also a master's program. And the Institute at the Federal University has been doing that. So it's with this institutional way that we're been moving forward, and we've been obtaining some results. And I invite everyone, those that are interested, of course, to log on to our website, INEAC, 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 apparently. If you put that on Google, www.ineac.gov.br. And after this quick presentation, I would like to say something about the importance of this topic that will be discussed in the seminar. First, it's important to highlight that this issue of identification has a lot to do with the issue of civil rights. And civil rights have a long history, let's say, a turbulent history in Brazilian law, and also in criminal justice and public security, due to slavery that we had when slaves they didn't have rights, they weren't seen as individuals, and also during the empire, where basically there were no laws. And when the Republic was created under the light of a mixed system, if you will, that mixed a territorial system together with a accusatory system. And then there was a division of the system between police and the accusation with the justice system. For 150 years, we've been having these discussions about this invention, this legal or social engineering, if you will. And actually, what happens is that police inquiries end up contaminating legal proceedings. Although the doctrine, in other words, what should be in a law, doesn't agree with all of this. Since our Constitution of 1988, we've been denying all of this, but really, in practice, which is what we do in ethnography and observational studies, many of our students, undergrad and grad students that help us out in this research, studying public security, and together with researchers, and the observation of police practices, tell us that in most cases, the presumption of being guilty starts and ends the entire process. Now, another issue in this context is the use of technology. In a system where the state has the public security forces and the rights of individuals. So these technologies will serve whom exactly? We're not sure. Here in Rio and Sao Paulo, a legal scholar came up with many definitions about these different systems. So these differences of finding someone who's guilty and then trying to prove that this person is guilty, and to find the evidence and to finally accuse. And so in this sense, you know, this clash between these two traditions, let's say, appears quite clearly when we look at police investigation or forensics, for example, but it's not always taken into consideration in court, for example. And this, of course, brings about an important issue in this system. Everything that I know, quite often I can't prove. In the other system, everything that I know, I want to prove. It's the real truth, as we usually say. Now, there's another issue regarding the use of evidence of what we see in forensics, the use, the Brazilian system is not adversarial, but it's mandatory. It's the judge, really, who decides for this real truth. And they can consider or not the evidence produced according to science. And quite often, depending on technology. So we see that this discussion is an urgent discussion in our country, extremely important discussion, because more and more technology is improving, and these systems are being utilized and will continue to be utilized more and more by institutions and by private firms as well. So it's a seminar that is extremely important, politically speaking, in terms of democracy and current affairs regarding public security. So, how is evidence represented by the players in the criminal process? How is this evidence, how is this information represented by the broader security system from law enforcement? So we can't always repeat this idea that there are second-class citizens or first-class citizens, citizens that are preferentially already guilty right from the get-go. In the Brazilian context of, former slaves, oligarchies, where not everyone is really equal in society. Some people don't fall into the system, and others are submitted to the system quite often. And mainly, how to develop technologies that will benefit society, and that won't only benefit certain groups that are in power or not. So anyway, it's always interesting to make a difference between suspect or suspicious. If somebody is a suspect, we need to define, the suspect is in a blue car, there are two people, a man or a woman. Here, the suspect is everyone, at a command, a police command, they stop everybody. So it's two different ways of identifying people that you want to investigate. And so we have a project approved here in Rio about police forensics and the representation, the production, circulation, consumption of these forensic reports. And also we've developed a project with funding about university security in the university campuses, public university campuses. It's an interesting place to study because they're heterogeneous. There are people from all different walks of life in the campus, and the use of technology that we're discussing with telecommunications engineering, computer science, etc. We've really been seeing the importance of social sciences in this discussion about the use of these new technologies. And so I'm going to stop here. Thank you once again for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you to everyone who's listening to us, and especially Professor Marcos, Professor Claudio, who are receiving us here. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor Roberto. I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Marcos. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to welcome everyone who is going to be with us in this cycle of seminars. Our colleagues here, Claudio, Professor Roberto, Professor Keith. It's really a great opportunity for us to be part of this cycle of seminars. As been said, identification, rights and control, and visibility, surveillance, and technology. And so I'm speaking on behalf of NEV-USP, coordination of the Center for the Study of Violence, also INCT from the Federal University of Rio, Fluminense. Now, NEV, in more than 30 years of research, has always tried to produce more knowledge in this area. It's what Professor Kant just mentioned, to do research, but also to disseminate knowledge that comes from this research and to encourage this debate about public policies. I think really Professor Kant would agree with me. This is a trait of many of our study centers in Brazil to initiate dialogue, scientific research associated to dialogue with civil society interventions, and also dialogue with operators. And so the center has always been working in this way. Currently, our funding is from FAPESP, the foundation here from the state of Sao Paulo. And our major research project is called Building Democracy Every Day, Human Rights and the trust and institutional trust. I invite all of you also to check out our website, NEV-USP. NEV-USP. You'll find us on Google. And so there, you'll see all of the characteristics of the research that we're doing regarding democracy in Brazil and its daily construction. And also with international ties. So, thinking about democracy and violence as an obstacle to democracy, social authoritarianism, and discourse that goes against human rights. So anyway, we have all this information on our website with our national and international production, and you can see all of this in our research. Now, with the pandemic, NEV-USP continued with its activities, like other colleagues, with virtual seminars, making these seminars available on our YouTube channels. And so we are investing more and more in their centers on these new ways of communication. I also invite everyone to see our human rights report. There's a new format now. We're coming up with podcasts, etc., to try and disseminate our research activities. Now, I only wanted to say that our cycle of seminars is quite special in this context, in our Center for the Study of Violence. Of course, all seminars are special for us, but this one is really quite special, I would say. First, I'm going to speak quickly because Professor Kant already talked about the importance of this topic, and the center is seeking to do new research, and the idea is to learn more about these issues. And I'd like to give a special thank you to Claudio Machado, that for some time now, I even tried to do the math, but I think we've been talking for 10 years now about the importance of doing research in this area, to come up with an event, organize an event to disseminate our discussions. And Claudio always played a very important role in all of this. And finally, now, with collaboration from the center and NEVI and other researchers that are looking into new technology, especially in public security and criminal justice. Ricardo Campelo, Daniel Edro, Leticia, and others who work in this way, we've been able to organize this event. That for us, it's an important partnership with INCT here at the Federal University. Professor Kant already talked about the importance of INCT and this ensemble, this set of work that we're doing in a network of the different centers spread throughout Brazil. So I'd like to thank, on behalf of Professor Kant, all those that were involved with INEAC. So Professor Keith as well, great opportunity to hear you, and also to think about future partnerships. And I'd like to thank the organizers here at the center, Chris and Alan, who are here with us, always providing great support, and other colleagues like Flavia in organizing this event, who helped us in this cycle of seminars. Anyway, so I'll be quite quick. Professor Kant already talked about the importance of the topic, but the idea is this: to discuss the challenges of contemporary practices in identification. There are many specificities here in Brazil, ethical, social, and political implications, highlighting this interdisciplinary perspective. I think what's interesting in the event, this is an opportunity to establish connections and interactions. You need to do networking. So we'll have not only researchers here, but also members from the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of power, social movements. I think this is an important trend, and really our role as researchers is to help to establish this dialogue, these connections, if you will, in the dimension of social life. That historians always talked about the individual, this attempt of establishing control technologies, and many things that Professor Kant mentioned. My doctorate thesis, that's exactly what I studied, how this has played out in Brazil. So I think this will be a great opportunity, to dive deep into this discussion, to establish connections between public policies, research, government action, and social movements, and also international connections between our research networks. So that's it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm sure we're going to have a great cycle of debates. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Marcos. Okay, so I also want to extend some thank yous to our colleagues Daniel Edler, Flávia Medeiros, and Ricardo Campelo. Together with me, we've organized the proposal for the seminar. We discussed in a very open manner all of the topics and the people who will participate in the discussions. Okay, so that's basically it. We've been trying to organize this debate for about 10 years now. We've naturalized, if you will, in the Brazil identification system. People believe that identification in Brazil is like this because it's always been like this in other countries. That's the way things work, and that's not necessarily true. We have some specificities, historical and social aspects, like Professor Roberto highlighted. And I personally, I'm not a researcher, but I'm a professional who works supporting the government, the federal government, the Ministry of Planning, to look at this topic as a strategic public policy for the country. And currently, I've been supporting the government with this. So I've been following this debate for some time, international production, and since the beginning, basically 10 years, I've also done the math. I started to see Keith's work in South Africa. He's a historian. He's written a lot about economic, social aspects in the mining regions in South Africa. And so he's dedicated a lot of his work to study how the state organizes itself, and really has done great work in the last 10 years, spectacular work, really, connecting the history, the adoption of identification practices in South Africa since 1850 until current days, and with very interesting events, the production of knowledge, of biometrics, how biometrics came about. There's the period in time. Anyway, I don't want to steal his thunder. Okay, I don't want to create a spoiler. He's going to present his own work, but I just want to highlight that not only Professor Keith is a specialist in this in South Africa, but in fact, he's collaborated in a global perspective. There's some other work that he's doing that's quite interesting. He coordinated together with Professor Simon Stratt, another historian from Cambridge, identification practices and documentation practices throughout the globe were discussed. Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Keith, for being here with us. We've already tried in other moments to bring together South Africa and Brazil, because despite many differences, personally, I see many similarities. many issues, many of the topics, exclusion, racial issues, authoritarian governments, and most recently, practices geared towards social inclusion of the state. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Those of you that are hearing us, we're going to have Keith now, and after, we'll have some time for a discussion, Q&A. Thank you, all the participants who are here with us, and questions can be asked directly on the YouTube channel in Portuguese or in English. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Professor Keith, please go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you. I won't do my thanks again, but people know how appreciative I am to have this opportunity to speak to people on that side of the Atlantic. So I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about the inadequacies of the major account of surveillance. And the key thing I'm looking at here is why we should be studying identification systems in detail, why we should not assume that the major theoretical accounts of surveillance are adequate, why we should be studying countries like Brazil and South Africa and Nigeria. I'm wondering if I can turn the
por trás da vigilância. O ponto-chave aqui é porque nós devemos estudar sistemas de identificação e não podemos supor que a vigilância é sempre adequada. Por que nós devemos olhar para países como o Brasil e África do Sul, Nigéria até? Bom, enfim.
Cláudio, muta seu microfone, por favor.
Se alguém está assistindo o YouTube dos integrantes da mesa, por favor, feche o áudio do YouTube ou feche o YouTube.
Shall I continue, Claudio? Because I'm getting the Portuguese audio back, or somebody's audio, and I can't, it's quite hard to concentrate with that feedback. So. Okay, I'm going to proceed, and hopefully it'll work. So to choose the most influential current argument in at least the English-speaking world, it's Shoshana Zuboff's Big Fat Book, which is an argument that we're entering into a new world of capitalism driven by the extraction of basically data trails from Facebook and Google's monitoring of how people behave online. And I sympathize, I agree with Zuboff that the Facebook and Google's monopolization of advertising revenues is a really serious threat. And I think we should do something about it. I think the company should be broken up. But I don't think it makes sense in the longer economic history or economic sociology of capitalism to speak about Facebook and Google as being a kind of break with older patterns of capitalist or interest in surveillance. So surveillance is really key to the way in which capitalism works. And you can see this probably most clearly if you look at the Fordist corporations, which Zuboff sees as being, the kind of example of good capitalism. She doesn't ask how those companies functioned, but if you look at the really excellent work that's been done on this, all those big Fordist corporations relied on credit sales, which were in turn dependent on extremely careful biographical surveillance, very highly moralizing, invasive, and very widely shared. So all information from all borrowers was shared. The credit bureaus, the companies sharing that information, were really active as early as the 1920s. They were present in Germany, in Britain, and other countries in Europe by that time, and really worked very well to control the risks involved in providing credit to people to consume beyond the immediate capabilities of their the wages that they were provided. So you see this system present in all basically in almost all modern capitalist societies. For example, they're very powerful in Australia, they're powerful in Canada, they're powerful in the Scandinavian countries, and long ago. So they're really potent and running properly by the 1950s and arguably much earlier. But you also see a long history and a distinctive set of arguments about what privacy should be. This interest in credit surveillance is matched to a set of arguments about what privacy should look like in each of these countries, and they are again different. The classic example, of course, is that the United States has a huge fear of official surveillance, but leaves private commercial surveillance more or less completely unregulated. In the United Kingdom, the state has ambitions to be more like a European state, more involved but it gets defeated by over and over again. Every generation it gets defeated in its attempts to become more like a Scandinavian or German state, because of this long tradition of mistrusting the bureaucracy in the United Kingdom, in Britain. But the most important point is that these privacy and surveillance systems did not really work at all in the former colonial countries. So countries that had experienced colonial rule have no institutional tradition of privacy, at least as far as it affects large segments of the population. Privacy arguments are often restricted to the very wealthy and sometimes simply to the leading figures in the government. And surveillance infrastructures themselves look very different when you examine them closely. This is important because it is no longer really possible to speak about theoretical accounts of surveillance that are derived from a single country or from a single city. You can no longer produce your explanation of what surveillance is if all you really know is Boston or Paris. You need a capacious account of surveillance, because ultimately these systems, they're all now global infrastructures aimed at tracking total population, everybody on the planet, or at least a significant portion of all the human beings on the planet. So what does African surveillance look like? In many respects, it's a mirror image. It was the opposite of what was happening in Europe and the United States. So as people in the United States were becoming more and more able or encouraged to participate in credit systems, Africans were being systematically prohibited from participating in the credit economy. So most important, this is true across the English-speaking and French-speaking colonies. So there's a set of interventions, essentially prohibitions on credit allocations and formal prosecutions for credit. So banks are prohibited. The banks wanted to lend to Africans, and the colonial state basically prevents them from doing that. This is true in Ghana, in Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and in South Africa. In South Africa, which is in some ways the driving center of this argument, the big cause of the move against the credit economy is a prohibition of what we call common lawyers, pushing common lawyers out of the areas in which Africans lived, so that the courts could not actually endorse or prosecute either contracts or prohibitions or violations of contracts, so that the whole world of credit activity moves into a kind of informal domain. and that made it very difficult, in fact, for Africans to access formal credit. It makes sense to speak about a kind of global credit apartheid across the continent, making it very difficult for Africans to access bank credit, and in particular for African firms to access formal credit. So the firms that exist on the African continent are distinctive globally across the world in their inability to go to banks and borrow money. Now, that might sound like a small problem, but it in fact is the big driver of the fundamental problems across the continent in making essentially economies function better. It also means that the systems of biometric identification that are being used now are being supported and justified as a solution to this problem of credit surveillance not working at all on the continent. And that's an important and paradoxical point, because one of the reasons why registration and credit systems don't work well on the African continent is because biometric systems have been there for so long. So they've been used on the continent for over a century, and they were used to strip out the older forms of registration that had been in place before in the 19th century. So this is a really difficult point, and I need to explain it a little bit slowly. So the best example is, in fact, in birth registration. So birth registration at the end of the 19th century was being handled in the countryside in southern Africa by African registrars, by people who were paid by the state to record births and marriages and deaths, but births was the real focus. And what happens is that the fingerprinting advocates in South Africa begin to argue that you cannot trust people who are paid to do registration, and you cannot trust Africans in particular to do registration accurately, and that the state should rely instead on targeting adults using fingerprinting. So abandoning the idea that the state can track the births of ordinary poor people, ordinary Africans living in the countryside. So you see a precipitous collapse of birth registration aimed at Africans outside of the cities from the early 1920s. And this is a model that stretches across the continent. And birth registration in South Africa remained below 50% until the end of the century. It's only started improving around 2000. And the reason it suddenly improves around 2002 is that the state begins to pay people a grant. There's an introduction of a child support grant. It works a little bit like Bolsa Familia. So people basically have a huge interest in registering the births of their children, and birth registration jumps in this very quickly over a 3-year period, and is much better now. It's over 90% in the first 5 years. So, but across the continent, birth registration remains very low, and the estimates are that most children under 5 births are not recorded on the African continent. So what you've got here is a strange, if you like, contradiction, that biometric ID systems that are computerized and easily developed and scaled across the continent are being presented as the remedy for weak paper-based systems, where in many respects they were the cause of the weakness of the paper-based systems in the first case. So, but that doesn't mean there's a single explanation for what happened here. In general, I think it's fair to say that what the biometric systems as they were applied on the African continent reveal is that what we could call, what Nietzsche or Foucault would call the will to know, has a very clear racial boundary, right? So that the will to know is animated and energized when it comes to the settler population, and indeed to the urban population, to the cities in general. The state is very vigorous in trying to find out how many people live in this place, how many people die, where they're born, what they die of. But by and large, there's no similar interest in what happens to the rural poor. And the story falls into 3 or 4 different chapters. I'm not going to explain it in great detail, but it tracks back to Francis Galton's interest in fingerprinting, which was initially targeting English people. You know, he really wanted English people to all be fingerprinted and to use fingerprinting in the English credit system. And the English, of course, said, "Are you crazy? You can't do this to us. We are not colonial subjects." So he turns at the end of the century and he begins to instead argue that fingerprinting is a great solution to the problem of the deceitful native, the native who hides his identity or lies about his name. And he pitches that solution to key figures in the British imperial bureaucracy, in particular Joseph Chamberlain and Alfred Milner and their subordinates. And they brought that system to South Africa, and it was very richly resourced by the gold mines. The system is deployed by Edward Henry, who's the main imperial advocate of fingerprinting, very important in developing the system in India, and who implements it in South Africa. And then again at Scotland Yard when he gets back to England. You can see a similar, exactly the same set of political questions in Gandhi's conflict with the South African state, which happens between mainly around 1902 and 1912. And Gandhi is actually an early advocate of fingerprinting, but he begins to realize that the fingerprinting technologies will be applied only and specifically to Indians and then Chinese and then Africans, but not to white citizens. So Gandhi is initially a kind of technological advocate. He thinks this thing, fingerprinting can solve this problem of essentially people being deceitful about credit contracts, and lets us bind them using biological information people cannot edit. But when he realizes that the colonial state in South Africa is going to target only Indian people, and including very wealthy and very sophisticated Indian merchants, he becomes extremely disillusioned. So it's a long and complicated story involving a lot of compromises and betrayal. And Gandhi, by the end of this, has basically lost faith completely in the whole European and colonial political system. And it's interesting that the fingerprinting was the driver of that discontent. It's also important that Gandhi then goes back to India and leaves the British state in India hyper aware, very sensitive to the political dangers that are present in attempts to impose fingerprinting. So, although fingerprinting was really invented in India in the 19th century, in the 1860s and 1880s, for most of the 20th century, there is very little of what we would call administrative fingerprinting in India. And it's only in the post 9/11, 2000, and the fintech era in which the Indian corporations begin to see the possibilities of fingerprinting solving a lot of the banking problems that the Indians moved to adopt fingerprinting en masse. We can discuss what Aadhaar is and where it comes from. So then at the core of the apartheid state is a system that we call the Bewijsbureau. Bewijs is the Afrikaans word for proof. Bewijsbureau is the Bureau of Proof. And apartheid, the technological order of the state was really hinged around trying to capture fingerprints from the whole African population. And I've written about the absolutely spectacular failure that follows from trying to make that work. What it did do is introduce a universal, extremely chaotic, but highly centralized repository of fingerprints at the center. One for whites, Indians, and coloreds, and another for Africans. The Bewijsbureau was for Africans, and everybody else was mixed into the population register, which was built for the South African state by IBM at the end of the 1960s. So we need to say a little bit about how this all works politically. I'm not going to go on at great length, but there are 3 distinct stages to the way the fingerprinting system worked in South Africa. The first stage was the building of containers, completely arbitrary racial containers, which had no basis in sociology and no basis in human biology, one for Indians, one for what we call colored people, people of mixed race, and one for whites, and a fourth one for Africans. And the state used arbitrary assessments in the 1951 census. So the census takers were instructed to basically tick a box. Is this person African? Are they white? Are they Indian? Are they colored? And those census classifications were basically used to build an administrative racial classification system. And the census forms had the standard census instructions and the note at the bottom saying that the state promises to keep the information confidential. And instead what they did was they used the assessments of that 1951 survey to build a complete race hierarchy for the country. And it was arbitrary and administratively, frenetic. People worked very hard to make it work. But all it was about was race classification. And then what happened in 1967 is they changed the law and they said, it's no longer a question of what the bureaucracy think, what do you look like? It is simply a matter of the paperwork. So how were your parents classified? If you were going to be white, you had to be both your parents had to be white. If one of your parents was classified white in the 1951 census and one was classified as Indian or colored, then you would be allocated to the colored racial group. So race in South Africa has this really strange and unusual quality of being generated by the paperwork itself. Of course, there are other scientific and pseudoscientific and university-based arguments about what race was, but for the state, the race was simply a matter of how the paperwork was allocated to your parents in the 1951 census. And then what happened at the end of the 60s is IBM begins to offer a very sophisticated population register to the South African government. This is the high moment of South African prosperity. The state is very wealthy at the end of the 1960s, mainly because of the prosperity of the gold mining industry. So they begin to look for this trophy project modeled on Scandinavian population registration, which was meant to cover everything. People would get this, big book. The book contained their educational history, their location, where they lived, gun licenses, driver's licenses, their military status. It's a huge panoptic project that the state hoped was going to build, kind of Sweden on the tip of the African continent. And instead what happened, and they paid for expensive IBM computers to make this work, hired lots of people, hundreds and hundreds of officials were appointed, and the whole system basically ground to a complete halt over the following 15 years. So by the early 1980s, the state was basically begging people to not apply for their Book of Life. And it was a catastrophic failure. So you had two large schemes of fingerprint-based identity by the early 1980s. And neither of them were working very well. They were both essentially chaotic and very poorly organized. But what happens over the course of the next decade is actually really interesting. And I think it's important for the current interest in what these biometric systems can and can't do. So the South African state abandoned the key political institution of apartheid in 1986. And this was influx control. Influx control was the set of policing mechanisms that were used to push people, either allow certain populations, certain people with work typically, to remain present in the white cities, and everybody else was pushed out in a complex system of policing and imprisonment that meant that there was a huge cycling of a really large proportion of the black population of South Africa through the prisons, right through until, really the beginnings of the 1980s. So at the end of 1986, they decided finally that it was impossible to actually make this work. Politically, primarily, it was just, the state was trying to focus on establishing control over the cities in the country. So they decided they couldn't make influx control work, and they abandoned it. And what's interesting for the wider debate around biometric identification on the African continent is that this prompted the state to wash the whole system clean of the racial and ethnic elements that had been the reason for doing biometric registration in the first place. So between 1951 and 1986, the whole point of the population registration project in South Africa was to basically, identify each person according to a race, and then allocate that person to a set of resources. So you got access to certain housing, you got access to land allocations, to certain kinds of work. It also meant you had to pay certain tax if you were classified according to a certain race. The whole system was built around a very complicated, the phrase I use is a kind of baroque frenzy of racial allocations. And that system was washed clean. So the ID number, which had built into it the racial classification, was randomized. And not only was race removed from, but all other racial and ethnic identifiers were removed from the ID system. So overnight, the state abandoned this obsession with racial and ethnic classification, and it began issuing ID numbers essentially randomly. So everybody got an ID number, but it was simply a determinant of whether they were citizens or not. And this is very interesting and important for the wider history of biometric registration on the African continent, because it's rare. In fact, I don't know of any of the current states adopting biometric systems who wash the older colonial hierarchy and older colonial system out of the way that their population registration works. So then you had a further stage from the early 1990s when the state began to move very energetically to issue these new ID numbers to everybody who might be eligible for one. So they were looking for ways ultimately of bringing into the electoral system anybody who was entitled to it. But they were also essentially looking for a way to bypass the exclusions that had been imposed on people by the Bantustan system. So the whole point of the Bantustan system was to push people's citizenship away from South Africa. And in the 1990s, they reversed that by allowing anybody who had any kind of claim on the South African population register to be issued with an identity document. Now, this is important because what it meant was large numbers of people, millions of people from Mozambique, from Lesotho, from Botswana, and from Zimbabwe and Malawi, basically were able to secure South African citizenship in that early period. So there's a real openness between 1990 and the end of the 1990s to accommodating people who had been crossing the border or had relatives or married into South African populations. And it also marks the early period of the ANC's government. So there's a real interest in trying to expand the numbers of people who are going to vote for the ANC during that period. And the next and sort of most important stage is the period that follows 1996, where the post-apartheid welfare state really expands this technology to include the poor in significant numbers. So and some of this is a similar plan to what was sold to the South African government by IBM. So the state begins to push a new biometric panopticon, if you like, and a new fingerprint-based population register that's going to capture all the information about people, what grants they're entitled to, what healthcare they're entitled to, their driver's licenses again, their obligations to pay child support. All of those things were supposed to be captured in a new system called the Home Affairs National Identification System. and they started doing this from 1995. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't do any of the things that the state really wanted it to do. It's been a complete disaster for example, the regulation of driver's licensing. It's had the opposite effect. It's made it extremely difficult, in fact, to register people for driver's licenses. But it hasn't done any of the forms of integrating that were pitched at the beginning. So people were told, this will allow us to, link the criminal databases with, for employment databases or the healthcare system or the prison system. It doesn't do any of that. But what it has done is given everybody in the country a single identity number, which is indexed to a set of fingerprints that have been digitized and which are actually now completely effective and function very, very well. So you can now go and get your identity card or your birth certificate or your deceased parents' death certificate. All of those things are available from a single division of the state, which has branches in all cities and towns. And before COVID was actually functioning quite well, I think it's fair to say. So passports would be issued in a week or 2 weeks. ID cards would be issued in 2 weeks. Those things were functioning quite well. The truth is COVID has had really devastating effects on how the bureaucracy functions. Everything has really, really slowed down. So it's important to capture, there's several things to note about this. So harness represents the opposite. It's 180 degrees of the opposite of what the apartheid fingerprinting project was all about. It was extended to everybody because it coincided with the introduction of a child support grant. The very poorest people in the country were encouraged to do the work of registration themselves, right? So it wasn't, they would come into the offices of the Home Affairs Department in order to capture the birth of their children, because it entitled them immediately to a small grant, right, which makes a huge difference to ordinary people. At the same time, the state pushed birth registration into all the government hospitals, and it imposed a set of requirements on the banks, the insurance companies, and the undertakers, so that it was impossible to bury somebody and to get money for burying somebody. And South Africans are neurotically obsessed with insurance for deaths, right? For funerals and for burials. It's one of the things we spend large amounts of money on. So the burial agencies, the undertakers, became kind of delegated branches of the population register, and that improved the quality of death registration very significantly. So in both cases, the resourcing of child support for newborns and the private insurance for undertakers and for burials pushed the system, made the system actually become very complete. And death registration in South Africa is much stronger, much better than it is anywhere else on the continent. It also coincided with a two-stage use of the biometric registration system for credit surveillance. So banks began to be able to query the central population register in order to prove identity. If you want a loan, the big loan companies don't even require you to bring any paper to your application. They'll look up your credit history against the very systematic credit reporting system, which is also centralized, and then check your fingerprints against Harness, the population register. They've got these little fingerprint readers, and that's driven credit surveillance. It's meant there's been a huge expansion. There was a huge expansion of credit provision for poor people, mostly around 2009. That has declined as the banks began to worry about the risks involved in lending to very poor people. And so there's been a real reduction in the lending to the very poorest people, the people who need it the most. But in both cases, what you see is a very effective use of a biometric system to provide what we could call the resources of citizenship. Now, today, it doesn't look quite as encouraging or positive. And this is for many reasons. One of them is that the administrative capacity of the state has declined over the last 20 years. Over the last 10 years in particular, much of that has to do with the effects of the Zuma government on appointments in the bureaucracy, especially at the higher levels of the bureaucracy. So there were many people who were appointed because they were seen as being agents or clients of the Zuma people, or of factions that supported Zuma, so that the state itself has become much weaker. It doesn't, many things do not function properly anymore. And so what you've seen is Home Affairs has been trying to find resources for itself, trying to build a model of resourcing itself that will allow it to raise additional funds. And its idea for doing this was to basically begin to charge for identification as a service. So instead of providing a free card, which can be used for proving your identity and allowing you to access all the services that are provided by the state, the idea was that Home Affairs would charge schools, courts, police stations to do lookups against the population register. Now, this is a new white paper. It hasn't been implemented. It's unlikely, I think, to function at all, because as soon as they begin to do that, people will simply stop using the system. There's no real reason why hospital administrators, for example, are going to ask people to pay their staff to pay for identification checks using the government system. They don't really need to do that now. There's no budgeting associated with the ID number, or there's no way for the hospitals to basically, be forced to do that. And if they do try and do that, the whole bureaucracy will very likely grind to a halt. So in most respects, what we're seeing is an unfortunate retreat, a kind of growth of incompetence, of despair around registration. And this affects all sorts of things. It affects the registration of land, it affects the registration of properties in the cities, the registration of companies. The most obvious visible form, and you can see this on Twitter if you look for it, is people's despair about getting driver's licenses registered and renewed. The whole driver's licensing system has been in a really shocking state of disorder. So population registration really hasn't succeeded in redefining itself as a kind of commercially justified enterprise. And one of the problems is that, and I think it's probably something that historians are responsible for, economic historians in particular, is that we've done a very poor job of explaining to people that the benefits of registration are enormous and unmistakable when you're studying societies in the long term and in comparison with each other, but they are very poorly captured by short-term markets. So you can't prove that population registration is a valuable service by essentially putting a price on it and asking the people who participate in the economy of registration to pay. Right? That's not where the benefits are generated. The benefits are generated in the macro economy and not in individual transactions. And we've done I think this, in general, I think social scientists and historians have done a very poor job of pushing back against the people who argue that the commercialization of ID actually is a way to strengthen registration. In fact, it is something like the opposite. Making people pay to do ID is simply going to kill the systems altogether. Right, there are 3 additional dangers that are not clear and will not be obvious unless you know and think about how these registration systems work. The first is what we could call the use of the numbering architectures of indirect rule. So in South Africa, this has been removed from the population register, but in most other African countries, the mechanisms of indirect rule are actually present in the ID number itself. So what does that mean? It means that, for example, in Zimbabwe, the number that you are allocated as your ID number tells the state not only what your tribe is, so in theory what your language is, whether you're Shona or Ndebele, but what your district is, what in theory where your family comes from, and your actual village. So it gives the state a mechanism for pinning people to particular places And then obviously asking the opposite question, which is, why are you not in the place that you belong, right? And that is an extremely powerful tool for authoritarian governance, but it also does something probably much more important and also dangerous, is that it allows everybody involved in political questions to say this person is an outsider. They're present in our village, but they belong somewhere else. And it has become very powerful in driving electoral politics. So local political entrepreneurs have been able to say, across the continent, these people are not locals. They should be in their own district. And if they're here, they're endangering us. And we must basically organize politically to expel them. And there is abundant evidence of violence directed against people using these, what we call the architectures of indirect rule, allowing the state to bind people to a particular geographical or cultural location, using a category that derives, in fact, from a form of government that was developed, 100 years ago. The second really important problem that is developing across the continent, and it's something that is particularly visible in a place like Kenya, is that you're seeing a new forms of what we could call data-driven statelessness. So most African countries have, as part of the way in which the colonial economies functioned, almost all African economies were dependent on massive cross-border migration. So, the local economy in Ivory Coast was dependent on large numbers of migrants coming in to work on the cocoa plantations. In Uganda, chiefs were encouraged to invite people to come across the border from Kenya in order to farm, in order to make their districts prosperous. In South Africa, there's massive, as in hundreds of thousands of people crossing the border in order to work in the industries and the mines. So you've got a long, historically determined economy, which is driven by the need for labor across borders. And these people have quite quickly found themselves, for whatever reason, eligible for registration as refugees. So people who cross the border from Somalia into Kenya have been housed in refugee camps that were funded by the United Nations. And as part of the resourcing of those refugee camps, their fingerprints were taken and they were introduced into these refugee databases. Now, the reasons they did it, may relate to the fact that they didn't have resources that they needed, but they may well actually have belonged to families that have been crossing that border for a very long time, at least a century. And it's not useful or meaningful to begin to build a theoretical boundary between most of these countries. Uganda, for example, Uganda is an arbitrary set of lines drawn on a map in 1885. The allegiances people have between different language groups, they have nothing to do with the political boundaries. So there's a real danger here of creating a new kind of statelessness that isolates people because they are seen as having made claims on the refugee resources that have been allocated to people crossing these borders. And this may have long-term, very serious effects. So if you just think about how COVID works, once you begin to isolate people and say, you are not a South African citizen or you're not a Zimbabwean because you come from Malawi or you cross the border from Malawi into Zimbabwe or South Africa, you're basically pushing people into very dangerous parts of the economy where no one knows anything about them and where just disease surveillance and almost all other forms of informality make life very dangerous. And states are also increasingly requiring ID for everything. To get access to a piece of land, to get access to a state hospital, to get your children access to schooling, states across the continent are being encouraged and are choosing to adopt these ID-related tests of eligibility. On the one hand, I think that's a really good thing, because what it does is it pushes people in order to get the credentials that they need, which should also entitle them to forms of welfare. But on the other hand, what we're seeing across the continent is real incompetence and inability to provide people with the ID card. So, this is true in Uganda. It's clearly true currently in Kenya. It's certainly true in South Africa. The state cannot actually manage the demand. It can't provide the demand that people need. So you've got a mismatch between the expectations of what citizens can get from the state and what the state is actually able to provide. I'm not sure how we fix that problem, actually, and I'm really worried about where we're going. It's not very encouraging at the moment. So then the question, just to sum up, why do we take the trouble to study the history and politics of identification systems in such detail? Well, the first one is that there are a lot of theoretical accounts of what these systems are for. People will say Foucault has told us everything we need to know, Deleuze has told us everything we need to know, or Zuboff has told us everything we need to know. In each case, the theoretical accounts actually are almost no help. They don't tell us anything about how these colonial societies work. The nice way to summarize this is what I say to my students, is that Congo is not the left bank, right? So Paris is a completely different political and economic and institutional order. And what happens on the African continent is in many respects the opposite of what happens in France or Sweden or in the northeastern parts of the United States. The details of how the systems have developed over time are actually distinctive in each of these regions. What happened in Nigeria is actually not the same as what happened in Ghana or in Ivory Coast. You've actually got to study them very closely. They're related, but they're actually distinctive, and they have distinctive effects on how the economy and society actually develops. But ID systems, whether they exist or whether they don't exist, lie at the core of how economics and politics works in all of these societies. So we've seen really amazing work done on the kind of local systems of identification that are developed in the absence of a working centralized state system. Almost all local economies depend on some kind of provisional form of ID that might be provided by a chief or a priest or a headmaster when the state doesn't do that. Or it can be done by a political organization that has nothing to do with the state. And these forms of ID actually describe the relationships between states and peoples much better than the normal conceptual accounts that we have that try to ignore ID. And they reveal a great deal about the distinctive political and economic institutions that exist in each country. And I really do believe that studying ID systems that have emerged in Brazil will tell us a lot about how ID, about Brazil itself, separate completely from how ID functions. And then the last reason why I would encourage people to do this is that ID systems are fantastically comparative. So we have really interesting debates about what the differences are between local government population registration, what land titling looks like, what birth registration looks like, what registration of religious affiliation looks like in all of the different countries. And they enable a discussion of how each of those things work between people working in this field. And then finally, what you can do if you're interested in doing this is it lets you participate in a kind of global discussion around how specific technologies and the companies that are pushing them spread around the world, and also obviously how they fail. So thank you, everybody. I hope the translation wasn't, I hope people managed to keep up, and I hope it wasn't too obscure. And that is me.
Okay, Keith, thank you so much for your exposition. Né? Your talk was very interesting. Eu vou retomar aqui, né? Nós infelizmente tivemos, né, algumas dificuldades com a parte tecnológica, né, para viabilizar a transmissão da tradução né, nos canais, né, no YouTube. Porém, né, o vídeo foi gravado com a exposição do Keith de forma perfeita, né, na transmissão no canal em inglês, né, no INEAC, e depois nós vamos
Channel,
disponibilizar.
and after we're going to make it available on demand, okay? And also, we'll see a way that perhaps we can provide the interpretation for this on-demand video. All right. So I would like to take advantage that Keith is here with us to have a Q&A, a debate, if you will. So if there are any questions in the chat, we can read your questions. And also, possibility for our colleagues who are here, Professor Marcos, and others, if you have questions. Also, other colleagues who participated in the organization of the event, if you have any questions, please feel free. Yeah, I would like to ask a question. Yes, Professor Roberto, please go ahead. Yeah, congratulations for your talk, Keith. Very interesting. I think, you know, it's very provocative, I would say, but I want to highlight two important issues that I see, okay? First, these similarities, perspective or outlook.
Com relação ao que o professor aqui
that we have, that we heard here, you know, the differences between the different identification systems, expressing differences of the relationship between the state or the different states with their populations. So in this sense, I'll call your attention to see what are the specificities. We even heard in the beginning that Brazil, differently from other states mentioned, has a strong state since the beginning, since the empire. And actually, we should never forget that we were, you know, we represented the Portuguese monarchy, and even police institutions that actually weren't police at the time, but they were royal institutions. There was no police, but that after transformed into police institutions. Anyway, this bureaucratic burden, if you will, inspired, like Stuart Schwartz says, inspired in bureaucracy. It's something that we even have nowadays in contemporary times, but that conforms this relationship between the state and its population, and how we identify ourselves. That calls our attention because this is conducted by the state and not by society, as we heard very clear here from Professor Keith regarding this tradition that we see in other authors like Foucault, how the origins are different in these control systems. So controls by the state and controls by society. So I think it'd be interesting to discuss this further. And I think the contributions for the future could be really important because will give us a new outlook, if you will, on control of these colonized societies, which is our case. With a difference, of course, it's always interesting to remember that Brazil is part of America. We made slaves and killed native Indians. In Africa, native Indians weren't really killed. We reduced native Indians, and we ended up with slaves and immigrants. And so we have this American face, if you will. So this persists until today. And that's what I tried to explain a little bit in the beginning. But anyway, I want to express my pleasure, okay, in listening to you. Congratulations for your talk, for contributing. And I'm very hopeful with the future of this cooperation, okay? Because I think we can get a lot out of this. I think it'll be a two-way street, if you will. I see this global general vision, you know, that everything seems to be the same, control is all the same, surveillance is all the same, and inspired a lot on many of the issues that you raised in these companies, private companies that we see today that control us with this, with a smartphone. We're all under this control. So thank you. And very, very satisfied. And congratulations to our colleagues, Marcos, Claudio, Flavia, for this initiative and everyone that's here with us. So it'd be great if we could really record this talk and have it available on demand, perhaps even with subtitles. That would help those that don't understand English, that will watch this later on demand. Thank you.
Sim, por favor.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, I also want to congratulate Keith for your presentation. What impressed me, you know, when we see other experiences, we think of the specificities of the Brazilian experience. And what I was going to raise as an issue, what do you think in terms of methodology, the comparisons? Because in a certain way, there are local characteristics. In the Brazilian case, for example, what I studied in the beginning of the 20th century, some identification technologies, digital, quite associated to criminology, positivist, but doesn't circulate throughout the country. So differences between the south of the country, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, this whole discussion also that we hear in Recife. So there's so many local specificities and national specificities, you know, Brazilian characteristics, but that we share some things with countries like Argentina. Some of these discussions, you know, about fingerprinting and other technologies in South America, this positivist criminology. So characteristics that are regional, but also international. How to think methodologically, you know, a comparison that involves local, I would call regional and international, okay? What Professor Kant mentioned, surveillance capitalism that seems to be the same everywhere, but it's not so. So how to think the comparison at these different levels? Yeah, thank you, Professor Marcos. I'm going to pass the floor to Keith for him to be able to answer these comments. And after, we have two questions from the audience. If you could, they're in the chat, okay? So if you could answer them, that would be great.
Yeah, I regret not making this a clearer point. I mean, I do think we can begin to map what Marcos was talking about, methodological questions. So we could say, there's a police interest in identification, there is a welfare interest in identification, there's a commercial credit finance interest in identification. And of course, there's the church too, I think the key driver, in fact, before the 20th century is religious conflict. And it's all about basically capturing souls. And the colonial state on the African continent mistrusts the church and wants to break the church's power. So, and then I think, we can think about different architectures. Some things are centralized, some local governments are old and strong, and they exercise control of they have discretion, if you like, of their own resources, they have their own tax base. All of those things can be discussed comparatively in a conceptual framework. I'm not sure I call it theory, but it's very interesting, and it's useful if you compare, say, Brazil to India. You can say, okay, in India, what was the big driver of identification in the 19th century is its contracts around rents and crops and debt between landlords and peasants, and the state is a revenue earner on top of that system. And we can map how that all works out over the course of time. In the 20th century, the big obsession in India is with caste redistribution. And it would be useful to think about what that looks like in Brazil. Is there a similar effort to try and apply categories of identification to address a social problem, which can quite often work the opposite way, that you can end up with new forms of politics that are derived from those kinds of attachments. So in India, caste has become, I think, very tricky question. It's partly redistributive, it's partly about more justice, but it's also driving new kinds of politics. And ethnicity and tribe work like that on the African continent. So I'm the one in saying we need to get rid of tribe. But most Africans are very interested actually in holding on to. They like these forms of affiliation. They like the forms of politics that are generated from them. So those container things, the core institutions and the containers can all be addressed methodologically and conceptually. And I think that would let us describe the differences between them. I mean, I do think the big difference is, and Brazil is not quite like India, and it's not like South Africa, but it has a much longer state form, much more distributed state form. The church is much more important actually in driving how that works. And I think those things are really interesting and well worth drawing out. But the point that I would focus on against Zuboff and Foucault and all the people who've written on this is that the boundary, Agamben is the one who said the most about this. So the point at which the state doesn't know anything is very powerful politically, actually. It's a key instrument for allocating resources. So if you don't capture births, if you don't capture deaths about a specific group of people, if you can define them as living in a void, you can actually allocate resources much more carefully to the group that are known. And it's not, I don't think Agamben is right that this is a core characteristic of liberalism, but it is really the core. It is how race-based societies function. So race-based societies build these very carefully, and well-resourced welfare states for a particular group of people, usually white people, and they define another population as being essentially unknown. We don't know if they're dying. We don't know because we don't ask the question, who's born and who dies. And the really interesting thing is that changes over time, and often it was better done. It was more carefully done in the 19th century than it is now. So all of those things, I think, would allow us to make raise comparative questions. I think in India, South Africa, Brazil comparison would be really interesting and useful. So Claudio, do you want me to go on and engage the questions that are in the chat as well?
Please go on.
Okay, so the first question is about surveillance in the Brazilian federal government, about which I know almost nothing. So what I could say, what can I say on this? I think I would say that South African and in general the African evidence would suggest it's not very useful to put the burden of surveillance and monitoring on experts and the parts of the hierarchy. You really have to provide ordinary people with an incentive to do it. You have to say, you're going to get an insurance payment, you're going to get, basically some reward from the bureaucracy that will mean you need to tell the bureaucracy about your whatever it is that you want to monitor. So surveillance without an incentive system doesn't work. It doesn't matter what it is, how biometrically sophisticated or scientifically sophisticated it is, unless you provide people with an incentive to participate in the system, they probably will not do that. And one of the reasons that credit surveillance works so well is that there's an obvious reward. You're saying to people, if you provide us with this information, the better the information is, the more likely it is that you will be able to access a larger credit system. And there are all sorts of ways in which people are trying to get around that, but I think the general rule still applies that if you want good information, you really have to provide people with an incentive for doing that. And that would bring me to final question, Ricardo's question, which is, what does DNA surveillance look like in South Africa? Well, DNA surveillance is a kind of elite fantasy in South Africa. It's a fantasy that, if we build an equivalent to the British DNA database, we can bring criminality, violence under control. No one who looks at the policing system in South Africa would believe that that is going to work. The police force, generally speaking, do not see themselves as being, there is so little. It's a very expensive system, but it does very little to provide policing for ordinary people, and most policing is privatized. So most effective policing is privatized, and it has no detective or investigative quality, Ricardo. So, the interesting thing is that the biometric system works, and it works primarily because of the fact that birth registration is incentivized. So people record births well, and that has provided a kind of platform to make the biometric system function after it has a long afterlife. But there's zero incentive to provide your DNA. You're just implicating yourself potentially in a set of really horrible engagements with the police. I would say it's very unlikely to function as an effective instrument. But I know people who believe that it will and have been investing lots of money in trying to get the state to adopt it. I'm very skeptical that will actually work.
Muito bem, Keith. Muito boa aí suas colocações. De fato, o contexto
Yeah, thank you, Keith. Actually, the Brazilian context, there are many specificities. Even for us, there are many elements that are unknown, let's say, because of the lack, let's say, of a more robust research agenda. We have some papers that we need to remember, very pioneer. Professor Sérgio Carrara, who studied, this period from the 80s, aspects related to identification and documents, personal documents in Brazil. And most recently, new papers, new publications from Marta, who actually introduced us, Letícia, who also does research in Rio de Janeiro. And most recently, Fernanda's thesis, ethnographic study on those that live without documents in Brazil, without papers. And I think this is an interesting point, for us to see as an issue. Here in Brazil, in fact, very few people noticed that in 2000, for example, 20% of births in Brazil weren't registered in the right time. 20% of the kids, Brazilian kids born. So people don't know this reality. Same thing nowadays, high percentage of people who are in prisons and who don't have official civil documents. They only have a biometric identification that's not associated to any type of civil right, only to get into the jail. And actually, there are people that don't even have that. So it's a set of elements, let's say, that's a scandal. And it's a critical situation, you know, where the state should pay closer attention, but also research institutions. That's a serious problem. Now, this entire discussion, you know, here in Brazil related to identification was very strong in the 30s, you know, and modernization of the Brazilian state, centralization of different policies during the Vargas administration, where we had the first national identification Congress. But since then, you know, the system that was shaped, if we look at the conclusions, our biometric identification system was shaped back there at the time. So there's an aspect here, you know, Keith, that you addressed. At the end, you try to make somewhat of a comparison, let's say, between what we have in Latin America, quite inspired in Argentina, also mentioned by Professor Marcos, and with the arrival of these technologies in Latin America. Also brilliant work from Diego, who, you know, studied identification technologies at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century in Brazil. So the question, Keith, really, if you could talk to us, in your point of view, from your vision, how can we see, you know, although you focus more on South Africa, it's global, really. So how, in your perspective, how do you see this relationship between how Latin America is part of this whole discussion in identification?
Claudio, we always have this. I mean, the problem is that I access the scholarship on Latin America only through what's written in English, and so it's very difficult actually to speak about this with any confidence. I do think in both cases, in India, in South Africa, and in Brazil, and in Mexico, and Argentina to some degree, what you're seeing is new kinds of states, new projects about trying to build a more inclusive state, but also in some ways to break with the older welfare and whatever. To reinscribe caste affiliations and people who are trying to wash those caste affiliations out of the bureaucracy altogether. But I think in each of these places, India and South Africa and Latin America, what you've got are the developing models for me, the real, and it's partly because I'm based here, but I do think it is also a demographic question. It's models for building new African states. So will the African states that develop on the African continent, in Congo or Angola, will they be modeled on Latin American precedents, or will they be modeled on an Indian precedent, or will they be modeled on what's happening in South Africa? And the reason is primarily because that's where people are going to be. You know, there's a huge expanding population on the African continent, and so there's a real effort, a scramble to adopt new solutions to apply to them. And I think there's I think we'll see what happens, but it seems there, there's also the Chinese state to some degree, but they're not that interested in these demographic questions. The demography really seems to be coming from Brazil, Mexico. The demographic government questions are coming from Latin America and from India and from South Africa. And I think that makes for a really interesting set of problems about what actually exists in each case and what the institutions and the politics actually what they look like. But I don't think there's any question that Latin America, Argentina in particular, Brazil also has been a kind of a key laboratory for the development of these systems for the last 100 and 150 years. And I think that'll carry on. And part of it is because the Latin American states have a much stronger institutional financial connection with these wealthy multilateral institutions that are based in Washington, D.C. They are actually you're closer to the World Bank, in fact, than most of the rest of the African continent is, and really a key part of how those debates take place. And this is something you see if you look at our friends who work in the World Bank projects or in the Inter-American Development Banks. They're really, they're much closer to the Americans, in fact. So the Americans in some ways are, although they're not directly involved, they're also key agents of how these systems actually get imposed on the rest of the world. So we will see. I don't have a lot of confidence, but I'm very curious to learn more, and I hope people will participate more in the debate. I mean, this network that Claudio and I belong to has about, I'd say, 200 people who are working on ID and registration systems across the world. Lots of Europeans, lots of Indians, a smaller number of Africans, but lots of people working on Africa. There's very few people working on Latin America, especially given the importance of these identification technologies and innovations in Latin America in the 20th century and how important those are in shaping what happens globally. There's really far too few people working on that at the moment.
Okay, Keith, muito obrigado mais uma vez.
Right, Keith, thank you so much. Thank you once again for everything. I think now we can start wrapping things up. I know we went over our time a little bit because of the technical issues. So thank you so much, NEV-USP, for all the support, especially the team that's working with the technology and who found a solution, a real-time solution. It's not easy. And I think we did it, It was a bumpy road, but we did it. And we're officially kicking off the round of debate. So we'd like to invite everybody to participate. It'll be every Wednesday, 5 p.m. local time in Brazil. So Professor Marcos and others for your final remarks, and Keith as well, if you have any final remarks. Professor Marcos, any closing remarks? Yeah, thank you very much, Keith, once again for your presentation. Thank you, Roberto Kant and Claudio. Thank you for the organization. And invite everybody to our next seminars. Okay, thank you. Thank you for everything. Yeah, also, I'd like to thank our audience who was here tuning in. And we hope that the debates will continue. Future cooperation and understanding of these different systems, because even something that Keith mentioned quite a bit, the creation of the subject in order to have rights on the one hand, and subject to control on the other hand. And so this is the dilemma really of this whole discussion, I think, at least in the Western world. And I hope that we can move together in all of this. With South Africa and India as well. And I'd like to thank the whole team. You were able to solve the technical issues. It was great. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. And I think we're done with the broadcast. Thank you so much.
Parou?
Acho que demora um pouco aqui para parar. Rodrigo, muito obrigado aí também pelo apoio na tradução, tá?